Hello, everyone. My name is James Stone, and I am a senior software developer here at Futurists and Helsinki branch. And today we're going to talk about easy bolt-on docs using React Styleguidist. So if you're not using React, I'm sorry. I think it's always important for a project or in a talk, like to have a question that you're trying to answer. And this is the question that I was trying to answer was how to document systems in React in kind of a React-ish way. Okay, so in this talk, I'm going to talk about the why not, the why not X. Does anybody have a guess what X might be? No guesses. All right, we'll all be in suspense. The how and the where. And before that, I'm going to talk about the who and the what and just talk a little bit about who I am, not to brag, but just to give you some context for what I'm going to talk about. So why trust me about this topic? So I'm the product of a clinical microbiologist, a scientist, and a car salesman. And so I had some photos, but they didn't make the talk. But my mom sent me a photo of me kind of examining a ladybug out in the forest, like very like silent and solemn. And then another picture that's probably my father, where I'm wearing like American football, in baseball hat, and there's like some guy playing like a fiddle, like a one-man band. So it's kind of like the experience meets science, or how do I back up this data of my experience? And for me right now, the experience is kind of like developer experience, good documentation, user experience, that kind of thing. I'm going to tell a very short story about how I went pro. So maybe you have a story about this as well. But I always programmed as a hobby. My mom, the scientist, actually taught me to program in second grade on an old Atari 600 XL set-top box or whatever, little keyboard with cartridges would go in. But the way I went pro is I got into kind of a battle with a nemesis. Does anyone here ever had a nemesis or currently have a nemesis or someone they're just like, ooh, no one, maybe online there's someone with a nemesis. You can be raising your hand online if you are. But I had a nemesis, and it was on the IRC, if anyone remembers that. And I lived in a small island called Bainbridge Island near Seattle, and I used to frequent this channel called Pound Seattle. And there was a guy, I used to think he was a little tyrant, who ran the channel very furiously. I didn't agree with him. And one day when there was a net split, I took opportunity and took over the channel for several days. And man, this guy was pissed. And he really hated me for that. And I thought that was so much fun. This is like back in high school, right? But what happened is we became friends after that. And he actually got me my first job as a professional programmer. So that's where I kind of transitioned from hobby into working professionally. And you might be wondering by my accent, you might go, hey, maybe this guy's not from Finland. I'm actually American. And why am I here? I don't want you to wonder why I'm here. So I'm here for science. My wife is an astronomer at the University of Turku doing her PhD. So that's why I'm here. And I've worked with Zerb Foundation, which is a framework similar to Twitter Bootstrap, top contributor. You can search me online. If you're a fan of that framework, you can talk to me after. I have some stickers, perhaps. Maybe you're interested, like I have here. All right. So the journey to React. I would say in the United States, at least when I was there and working with American clients, React adoption has not been as high as it is here in Finland, or maybe you might say in the Nordic area or in Europe. And so I came from this other A word, I'm sorry, and they renamed it, right? They added like a JS at the end, which was kind of also irritating at the end. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about my journey to React and what that was like. And so I found this on Wikipedia, this 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, and finally through acceptance. And I thought that I wanted to give like a visual depiction of what this is like, with this kind of sad face and a happy face. And there's a few more steps here, but you know, you have this denial and then anger and bargaining, and then finally kind of come out through acceptance after depression. So kind of in this phase, if you're a little spoiler alert there, right? Denial, I thought when I started getting to React here in Finland, I thought I'm just going to do this until Vue.js catches on. So I thought that's cool. It's a lot more like Angular, right? and certainly in denial. And then I remember being really pissed about like these nested ternaries, like these button components. I'm like, why would you make a component of a button? And then CSS and JS. Maybe I'm a bit old school, but I just got really mad about that. And I'm thinking back, I don't know why. Maybe I'm just like a grumpy old man or something. I'm like, those kids. And then the bargaining, I was like trying to figure out, okay, how can I make React more like Angular? And does anyone know this Wix React templates project? Yeah, one person nodding. Maybe there's a couple people nodding. Yeah, I thought this is going to be awesome, and then I saw no one using it. I'm like, okay, that sucks. And the depression, I went through endless videos and tutorials, and it was kind of depressing. I'm like, this stuff is not making sense to me in my worldview. And today I'm okay with React. I can accept where I'm going, but now functional programming and maybe Elm, I'm moving on to another cycle, I think. So I'm going to talk about living style guides today. Has anyone created a living style guide or worked with that in a project before? All right, we've got 1, 2, 3, maybe some people online. So I've been building these for some time, for about 4 or 5 years, mostly with the Zerb Foundation framework and a tool called Panini. And a lot of what I'm talking about, I think, applies regardless of the tools and techniques that you're using. So I want to talk about why we would do this. So one reason why is to foster better communication, play to your team's strengths, right? So if you have a living style guide, people who are good at specialized things can kind of focus there and maybe less on the UI and those specific components. Avoid conflict between teams. So one thing I see a lot of is designers or other stakeholders calling things different names in a project. So this can really help unify by having a public coded style guide. Produce a better quality product, more design consistency, less meetings. And this is also, these things are from a course that I created on design systems. But basically, I found that there's 2 ways to really get started with a design system that works for an organization of any size. And that's front-end code, and what we're talking today, a living style guide. And again, more benefits, low-hanging fruit. It's the fastest, least amount of effort, biggest rewards. All right, so nobody guessed it, but Storybook is the other one. And they actually make a great comparison here. You can go check, and I'll have the slides after, but this React Styleguidist cookbook, they make a really good comparison. It's not very biased. But in Storybook, you write all your stories in JavaScript files versus Markdown. I'll show an example of that. How you describe the components, which I'll also show an example. And you can only show one variation of a time versus multiple. And so Storybook, I think, is more like using a microscope to look at things. It's like just a single component at a time, like this component, this variation, single page, single component, and you switch between them. All right, and React Styleguidist also gives you auto public method documentation, all the components on a single page, and I think this is really important for documentation on a project. Extra documentation added so you can make it into a proper design system, and it's very easy to do that. It can be branded, and I think this is something that really helps. You don't want it to look just like a generic style guide, right? You want it to look like the project or the organization in which you're working with. And I wasn't sure about this, but you get some docs auto-generated, and I think that maybe both projects do this, so I'm not too sure. And so here's an example from Storybook, the X comparison. And to me, this looks a lot like kind of a testing suite where we're importing the library and then we're going through, and you might think of this button module as kind of a describe. And it's kind of everything that we're wanting to look at is kind of embedded in all this JavaScript. But what I like about this is we have a markdown file and we can add whatever we want to this, but this is looking a lot more like how if I was experimenting in the code directly, just trying to get some sort of effect. And so I think that this is a lot more conducive to understanding how the project is working. So I have a short demo. It's more that I'm just going to show you a project that I've been working on adding this to. It's not like a live coding demo, but I'll just show you how it's working. And a lot of the point of this talk is just to kind of show how easy it would be to add this to a current project, something that's been in progress. It doesn't have to be something from the ground up. And so here, we basically just added React Styleguidist to our project through NPM. And basically I've added 2 scripts, which basically runs a server similar to if you're using like Webpack Dev Server or Create React App. and then also a build process. And you can integrate these in different ways. It doesn't have to be this way. It's very flexible. And then there's a config file. And if you're interested what this is, basically I've taken from the Redux examples, their to-do MVC app, and kind of bolted on some docs to that existing app to kind of show how you would do that. And I'll give the link at the end of the presentation, so you don't have to try and copy or do anything like that. And this is just basically all the documentation sitting here in a separate file for configuration. And I think the most important things to kind of talk about quickly is you can have a version. Basically, we can add new parts of the documentation. You see I have like a clickable link here. I have other markdown files. You can also ignore specific components, like maybe you don't need to expose all the components in your style guide. Maybe they're more for logic and not for, to be reused throughout the app. So I'm going to fire up the server. All right. And so this is just a simple React app, right? So we can play around with this. And then we can open up the style guide on the right side. It's conveniently running on a different port. Now, I haven't taken the time yet to kind of theme this to make it look branded, but this is kind of what you get out of the box, kind of for free. It's a little bit hard to see on the screen here, but there's like a filter by name, searching. You've got the documentation. So like here's an install. You can add really anything that you want. Here's some examples of some of the documentation. They're all on a single page. And we can see kind of these coded example pairs right here where we have the live code right below the live example being rendered in the browser. So it's good for browser testing. And we also can go and make modifications to this and also kind of zoom it in full screen to get kind of a closer view of this single component. So all these are kind of fully editable and kind of this little sandbox playground and per component. So the basic way that this is done is just by adding a markdown file with an example. And really this can be anything. It could be several different examples, all sorts of additional text, anything you could put in a markdown. Could be an animated GIF, anything you need to do to kind of clarify how that system's working. It lives here, and it can also be co-located, just like with the tests, and it doesn't interfere with any of your build process. And the other thing that I like about this is it also serves as documentation without the style guide. So if you're just opening up the repo, you could open this and look at what an example of using it might be. So I'm going to continue this after the talk and kind of keep building up this particular project. And I gave a talk the other night, and I mentioned a couple of other projects. One was React Foundation that I might expand as well. And I actually met the creator of that project at the meetup, which was pretty cool. So I'm going to kind of continue to expand this set of documentation if you're interested or want to follow. And you can just go to github.com, jamestoneco, because all the Jamestones were taken, React Styleguidist to do. And that's it. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes.
So, hey, thanks for the talk. Who do you see would be taking the role of writing this style guide? Would it be the designer cooperating with the developer? Is it just like the most front end of the front end developers who would start writing like, hey, this is how it's designed, and hey, this is how you should use these components, and these are the colors you should use, and so on?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think with like many design systems or style guides in general, like they can fall into two camps. Like they can fall into being like so engineering heavy that they're not really versatile or usable by the rest of the team, or they can end up looking a lot more like brand guidelines, which are kind of like, here's the logo, but like you don't really need to know about the logo too much for the website. Mm-hmm. So I think the ultimate thing would be to having either someone who understands both, or a designer and engineer working together, or someone who's kind of crossing over. So I think if a designer understands design well enough to code their own kind of CSS and front end code and get started with that and can use GitHub, I think that might be a really good person. Or otherwise, it might be two people kind of working in conjunction. And the way I've been working has kind of been building front end code in isolation of like the actual front end or the actual back end. So that's like a way to kind of further isolate and test things. And some people are following that process as well, but it just depends on the project and how it goes. But the big thing is with the coded style guide and having this in React, if you're building a React project, like it becomes much more useful to the team, the engineering team. But I think if you build it without the input of other stakeholders in the design, then it's not really going to be used outside of that or as a communication tool. Are there any other questions? Maybe from online?
Well, I could ask a tangential question.
Sure.
Do you know anything for React Native, a similar kind of style guide thingy? I'm not even sure how it would work, like as a web page or as an application. Or...
Yeah, it's a great question. So I do not know of anything for React Native, and I think the difficulty would be is it would have to almost be a native app or running like a native app to be able to give you this, coded example pairs. But I think you could still figure out a way to build a similar system that would document the UI patterns, but making it automatic. I'm not too sure, but it seems like a good problem to solve.
I don't have a particular question, but just to add something to that question, that was actually a very good question because sometimes you want to share your components. Since React makes it really easy, you want to share it across different platforms. And people might not consider it like as a really hard task, but it's really hard to accomplish because no matter the React, how easy it is, it's really hard to accomplish the same task on same stylings on different platforms. It's really hard because the standards are different and the implementation details are far from, like, really different from each other.
Mhm.
But the thing is, if you really want to like do that and avoid using native platforms, like there is some application called AppStack that Expo uses it for demoing the components probably. There's something like that, but that's like a paid application. But I'm not going to get into that. But the thing is, one technique, instead of like generating the documentations automatically, one technique might be to create headless components and then leave the implementation details to the app level instead of the design system level. In that case, you can just like take care of the documentation for the headless, which is just managing the logic, not the implementation detail.
Yeah, and maybe just quickly to expand on that idea. So the idea of a coded style guide, I don't know that they often are expanding across multiple platforms, but there is this idea of design tokens, and I think that's really worth looking into, which is having a set of variables and tokens that can be used across different platforms. So you can get like typography and spacing and color consistency. So I think that's maybe a good entry point. And then the answer is I don't know in terms of like how to go further with that. All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you.